Welcome to my screencast, the subject of which is the abandoned village of Manah in the Sultanate of Oman. Manah is an interesting settlement in as much as, although it's abandoned, it's actually surrounded by a good deal of fully inhabited normal Omani villages. So it's not devoid of human contact, and there are plenty of visitors, and it's a popular place to go to take photography of old Omani town houses. It's a fairly old settlement and has been inhabited pretty much constantly from the 6th century BCE. And remained inhabited up until the second half of the 20th century. So it's only been vacated and abandoned in quite recent history. It's located in the ADLS region of Oman, just south of the regional centre of Nizwa. So it's in a sort of gravel desert area to the south of the Jebel Akhtar region of northern Oman. It was an agricultural settlement, and the two main crops that used to be produced were sugarcane and obviously dates, very popular in the region. Fields of sugarcane and date groves were irrigated by a complex system of ancient aqueducts known as falage. And in fact, there's evidence that the falage system was installed by ancient Persian engineers and has more or less been kept going and intact up to the modern day. Sadly for the village, sugar production ceased to be profitable, and the village was therefore steadily abandoned as inhabitants were encouraged to move away to nearby modern housing developments in the 1960s onwards. And in fact, some people moved further afield to Nizwa and off to the coastal regions. Manah's construction styles tend to be fairly simple from the outside, but nonetheless extremely efficient housing in terms of the thickness of walls being very thermally efficient, keeping the heat out and the heat in when you needed it at night, but the heat out during the hot parts of the day. There are no stabilised metal roads around the village, and most of the tracks within the village are fairly tight, so it's really designed for human and load-bearing animals only. Mud brick on stone foundations tends to be the norm, although there are some stonework embrasures and towers and walls on the perimeter of the village. These should all be and would have originally been faced with an adobe-like rendering called locally sarouge, which was a fire-baked clay that was then powdered, water added and then applied like a render. Unfortunately, if this is not maintained, the brickwork and the mud bricks becomes fairly exposed and quickly degrades with more rain and more wind erosion. The building characteristics are typically old Oman and very common throughout the ancient parts of the Middle East, although sadly becoming rarer as Middle Eastern rulers go for something more modern, and glass and steel tends to predominate where there used to be these sorts of townscapes. The old parts of Manah obviously rely on these natural shade and wind cooled common areas. Security against raiders which was a common construction technique in this part of the Middle East, as it was a fairly lawless part of the world for some time. Windows always tended to be high level rather than at ground and street level. Doors tended to be very substantial and easily secured. They also had a great deal of adaptation to make the best use of wind, to remove heat from structures by use of wind towers and alcoving, to make the best use of any wind that was moving around the space, so natural air conditioning. All of which I think is worthy of preservation, because these sorts of building styles are now very much out of fashion in a lot of the Middle East. And I think it's worthy that we try and maintain some record and some evidence of how they worked. And the best way to do that, in my humble opinion, is to preserve some of these villages. Sadly, although the archaeology and the site has been investigated by local and international museums and universities, it is an open site, and local attitudes to it are leading to some fairly poor stewardship, and decay and destruction is becoming quite commonplace around the village. It has been plundered by the locals and also by expatriates, it must be said. It's not just the locals that cause damage. The other sad thing is it is surrounded by a lot more iconic sites that tend to attract a lot more tourist attention and finance. And the Adakalia region is in the interior, and that's some way from the coast where most of the tourists tend to go. But this is an area of Oman that I think is a treasure trove and rich with amazing culture that should be seen. And I think it would be a great place to visit and stay if some of these sites could be renovated as both visiting as visitor locales, but also possibly accommodation sites if they're adapted. So certainly there's some real potential for developing local cultural sector, which would provide income and employment for the people of the region. Sadly, it's not the only abandoned settlement in the region. There are plenty of them, but a lot of them are going the same way. So there needs to be a concerted effort to try and preserve what's out there already. The ruler, Sultan Qaboos, has been an excellent promoter of culture, but sadly, the Sultan is not as rich as its neighbours, and therefore money is not as freely available as it might be. But we're hoping that if the right sort of tourism comes into the region, then you start to see a virtuous circle of income coming in, looking for these sorts of experiences beyond the conventional tourist routes. And you then breed a lot more investment which can be used to preserve the sites. So I think there has to be a compromise. Obviously, tourism is needed to keep the income coming in to preserve sites like this. As it is now, though, Al Manah, if left untended and unmended, will become an even worse of a challenge in terms of preservation and renovation. You can clearly see that once the mud brick structures are eroded, they collapse fairly easily, and then that almost exacerbates the whole process as more and more of the elements get in to cause damage. I think, from my perspective, I'd like to see that we could that the site's perimeter could be better protected and renovated to ensure you've got some defensible space. The older mud brick structures must be stabilised and recorded so that you can then carry out sensitive renovation afterwards. And I think some of the key buildings in the village need to be preserved, especially which are suffering a little bit from desecration and graffiti and vandalism. And the old mosque, the masjid, is one clear example. Here are a few references which you might find an interesting read, and I must stress that all of the photography and opinions are personal, and there is no copyright material used in this presentation. Thanks very much.